My name is Daniel Hale. I have never shared this story with anyone outside my family, not because I don't want to, but because I don't think anyone would believe me. Even now, a year later, I can't convince myself that what happened in the Smoky Mountains that October night was real. But I know it was. I feel it in the deep, hollow ache that fills my chest every time I think of that sound. The knocking. It was a Thursday when we left for the Smokies. Claire, my wife, thought the mountains would be good for us. She said we needed to unplug, reconnect as a family. I didn't argue. I needed the break as much as she did. Our 8-year-old daughter, Lily, had been struggling in school, and Claire thought nature might help clear her mind. The drive was uneventful. The trees lining the road seemed ablaze with reds and oranges, their colors only deepening as the afternoon light began to fade. By the time we reached our campsite, nestled deep within the park, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. Our spot was isolated. That was intentional. I had wanted quiet, not the hum of other RVs or the chatter of tourists. Our RV was parked at the edge of a dense thicket, with towering trees casting long shadows over us. The air was cool, the smell of damp earth and pine needles settling over us like a blanket. By the time we had set up, it was pitch black outside. The Smokies don't have the kind of darkness you find in the city. Out here, it's absolute. No streetlights, no neon signs, just the void and the eerie glow of the moon. Lily had fallen asleep quickly, bundled in a cocoon of blankets on the RV's pull-out bed. Claire and I sat at the small dining table, sharing a bottle of wine. The silence outside was soothing, almost hypnotic, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I locked the RV door, double-checking it out of habit. Claire was already asleep by the time I slid under the covers. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the RV's generator. That's when I heard it. Knock. 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 3 slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was testing the door. My first thought was that it was another camper, maybe lost or needing help. But then I remembered we were the only ones at this site. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. Claire stirred beside me but didn't wake. I waited, straining to hear something, anything beyond the low hum of the generator. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My chest tightened as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The RV's interior felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in as I crept toward the door. I glanced at Lily, still fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in the pale light. I reached the door and peered through the small peephole. Nothing. Just the blackness of the woods. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the lock. Something about the silence outside felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to run. Then, just as I was about to turn away, knock, knock, knock. The sound was impossibly close, as if it were coming from inside the RV itself. My breath hitched as I spun around, shining the flashlight into the small living space. Nothing. "Daniel?" Claire's groggy voice startled me. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Shh," I whispered, holding up a hand. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. "There's someone outside," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt inadequate. Claire slid out of bed, pulling a sweatshirt over her pajama top. Together, we stood near the door, listening. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. Then came the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. The sound vibrated through the RV, setting my teeth on edge. Claire grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Daniel, what is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The growl faded, replaced by heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the RV. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But the footsteps continued, methodical and unrelenting. Then, the knocking started again. Knock. 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 It was louder now, more aggressive. Lily woke up, her small voice trembling. Daddy? What's happening? Nothing, sweetheart, I lied, my voice cracking. Go back to sleep. But she didn't. She sat up, clutching her stuffed bear, her wide eyes darting between me and Claire. The knocking grew frantic, like fists pounding against the metal door. The RV shook with each impact. Daniel, do something, Claire hissed, her voice trembling. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small hatchet we had brought for chopping firewood. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the handle, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching on for what felt like hours. I didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for the next sound. That's when I saw it. Through the window, just beyond the tree line, a figure stood watching us. Its shape was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but its eyes glowed like burning coals. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the hatchet. Claire saw it too, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke. Let me in. The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. The voice was wrong, like a distorted recording played backward. No, I whispered, though the word felt meaningless against the weight of its presence. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then, without warning, it lunged toward the RV. The next moments were a blur of panic and chaos. The RV shook violently as the figure slammed against it, its glowing eyes filling every window. The growling returned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Claire screamed, pulling Lily into her arms, as I swung the hatchet wildly, though there was nothing to hit. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence was so abrupt it was almost deafening. The RV was still, the darkness outside impenetrable once again. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't dare move until the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. When we finally stepped outside, there was no sign of the figure, but the ground around the RV was littered with deep, claw-like marks, as if something had tried to tear its way inside. We left that morning, abandoning our plans and cutting our trip short. I don't know what we encountered that night in the Smoky Mountains, but I do know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. Sometimes when the nights are quiet and the wind is just right, I think I can still hear it. Knock, knock, knock. Yosemite National Park, June 2017. A place of untamed beauty, where the mountains carve into the sky and the air feels heavier, alive with the weight of centuries. I had been on the road alone for weeks, traveling in my RV, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Freedom, maybe. Or escape. But when I pulled into the secluded campground on the park's outskirts, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me like a shadow. The campground was almost empty, just me and one other RV parked at the far end. Their curtains were drawn tight and no one stirred. Good. I liked solitude, or at least, I thought I did. The spot I chose was at the edge of the forest, where the towering pines formed a dark wall that swallowed sound and sunlight. It was perfect for a quiet night, or so I told myself. That afternoon, I decided to explore. The main trail was well marked and wide, but as I walked, I noticed something odd. About a mile in, a narrow, overgrown path veered off to the right, barely visible beneath the underbrush. It wasn't on the map, and something about it called to me, like a whisper, just at the edge of hearing. I hesitated. I am not the kind of guy who scares easily, but there was something wrong about that trail. The way the trees seemed to lean closer together over it, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so thick that the sunlight couldn't penetrate. It felt untouched, forgotten, as if the world had moved on and left it behind. Still, I couldn't resist. Curiosity has always been my downfall. As I stepped onto the path, the air changed. It was cooler, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang, like blood or rust. The sound of the forest fell away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. My footsteps sounded too loud on the uneven ground, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. Time felt slippery, like I had been walking for hours, but the light hadn't changed. The trees began to look the same, blackened trunks with jagged scars, like claw marks raked across their bark. I thought I heard movement behind me, the crunch of leaves underfoot. But every time I stopped and turned, the forest was still. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Maybe. Then I saw it. A strange marking carved into one of the trees. A crude symbol, like an eye with jagged lines radiating outward. It wasn't the kind of thing nature did on its own. Someone had put it there. I looked around and saw another, and another. The same symbol repeated on the trees ahead, each one more jagged and uneven than the last, as if the hand that carved them had grown frantic. I should have turned back. I should have run. But something about the trail pulled me forward, like a hand on my back, guiding me deeper into the woods. The forest grew darker, the trees denser. The air was thick and damp, and the smell of decay hung heavy. Then, I saw the cabin. It was barely more than a ruined wooden walls sagging inward, the roof half collapsed, vines crawling over every surface. It shouldn't have been there. This part of the park wasn't meant to have structures like this, not according to the map. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin. The windows were black, empty sockets that seemed to watch me. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, though I couldn't feel any wind. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like breathing coming from inside the cabin. It wasn't human. My heart thundered in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But my legs wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a cold, sickening certainty that whatever was inside the cabin knew I was there. The door creaked open wider, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Not an animal, not a person. Something wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and as I fell, my eyes caught the trees around me. The symbols carved into the bark were everywhere now. Dozens of them, and they were freshwood shavings littered the ground beneath them, as if they'd been made moments before. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The trail seemed different, twisted and unfamiliar, like it was leading me in circles. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my arms and face. I could still hear it, the thing from the cabin, moving through the woods behind me, faster than I thought possible. When I finally broke through the tree line and stumbled back into the campground, I thought I was safe. My RV was right where I'd left it, a comforting beacon of familiarity. But as I got closer, I saw the scratches. Deep, jagged gouges ran across the windows and the sides of the RV, as if something with claws had raked them over and over. The door was open, though I knew I had locked it. Inside, everything was as I had left it almost. On the kitchen counter was a piece of bark, fresh and damp, with that same eye-like symbol carved into it. I didn't stay the night. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. Its eyes were like the symbols, jagged and hollow. I never went back to Yosemite. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low, guttural breathing. And when I do, I swear I can feel the scratches on my windows. It was the kind of heat that clung to you like a second skin, even as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Chisos Mountains. Big Bend National Park in July isn't for the faint of heart. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mesquite and desert blooms, and the cicadas cried out like restless spirits. My name is Daniel Hart, and I've been a ranger here for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the vast, desolate stretches of this park. Everything from lost hikers to unexplained lights in the sky. But nothing comes close to the events of that night. It started innocently enough. July 15th, 2018. The park was quieter than usual. most visitors deterred by the relentless summer heat. I was on the late shift, patrolling the Rio Grande Village area when I spotted their RV, a sleek white vehicle parked neatly at one of the designated camping spots. The fire pit nearby was lit, flames dancing lazily against the twilight. From a distance, I saw the couple sitting close together, silhouetted by the firelight. They looked peaceful, laughing softly as they shared a meal. I didn't think much of it. Campers were common, and this pair didn't seem any different, just another couple escaping the chaos of city life for the serenity of the desert. The next morning, I returned to the spot during my rounds. The fire was still burning, reduced to embers, but still alive. That struck me as odd. It's park protocol to fully extinguish campfires before turning in, and most visitors are pretty diligent about it. The RV was there, parked in the same spot. But something about it felt wrong. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "Hello? Park ranger here. Just checking in." No answer. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The windows of the RV were tinted, giving me no clue as to what was inside. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual. But when I tried the handle, I noticed something strange. The lock was engaged from the inside. That's when I noticed the chairs around the fire pit. 2 of them, perfectly placed, with blankets draped over the backs. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the small camping table, as if the couple had simply stepped away for a moment. But the food was untouched, now buzzing with flies. The air felt heavier, colder, despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. I radioed back to the main station, reporting the situation. By noon, a search team had assembled. We started combing the area, calling out their names, Rachel and Mark Lanning, according to the park registry. Their RV was towed back to the station for further inspection. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Their clothes were neatly folded in the drawers. A pair of hiking boots sat by the door. The only thing missing was them. The strangest part? Their personal items, wallets, phones, keys were all still inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The search extended for miles around the campsite, but the desert gave us nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings. Just the endless expanse of rock and sand, indifferent to our desperation. 3 days into the search, one of the rangers found something. Deep in a ravine, miles from the campsite, he came across a circle of scorched earth. In the center was a pile of ash, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. None of us could make sense of it. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind. Their laughter by the fire, the untouched food, the eerie stillness of the RV. Around midnight, I decided to review the footage from the trail cameras we'd set up near the campsite. At first, there was nothing unusual. The couple arrived at the campsite around 6 p.m., laughing and unloading their gear. They set up their chairs, lit the fire, and sat down to eat. But then, around 10:30 p.m., the footage became strange. The screen flickered, static distorting the image. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something tall and shadowy moving just beyond the firelight. It was there, and then it wasn't. The next few frames showed the couple looking around nervously, as if they'd heard something. Then, the screen went black. When the footage resumed, the fire was burning alone. The chairs were empty. Word spread quickly among the rangers, though we were careful not to alarm the public. But fear has a way of creeping in, silent and insidious. Every night, I found myself drawn back to the campsite, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't an animal I've lived in this park long enough to recognize every howl, growl, and screech the desert has to offer. This was something else. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light landed on something in the distance, 2 faint shapes standing side by side. My heart stopped. Rachel? Mark? No response. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. And then, they were gone. The official investigation lasted 2 weeks before it was quietly closed. The report listed their disappearance as unknown causes, a vague term that offered no comfort. But I couldn't let it go. I started digging, poring over old records and local legends. That's when I came across the story tales of an ancient curse tied to the land. They spoke of a shadowy figure that roamed the desert, luring unsuspecting travelers into the night. Those who followed never returned. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. But every now and then, as I patrol the park, I hear that low, guttural sound echoing through the canyons. And I wonder if Rachel and Mark are still out there, trapped in the endless expanse of Big Bend, forever lost to the desert's embrace. If you ever visit, be careful. And whatever you do, don't follow the shadows. When I first decided to visit the Grand Canyon, it wasn't for adventure or thrills. I had been going through a rough patch, the kind that chips away at your sense of self and leaves you wondering what's left. My name is Caleb Watson, and back then, I was just another guy trying to find some peace. My best friend Drew and I planned the trip on a whim, deciding that a few days of camping away from the noise of life might help us reset. We arrived at the South Rim in the late afternoon. The sky was painted with streaks of amber and violet as the sun sank low on the horizon. The sheer scale of the canyon silenced every thought in my head. The endless expanse of jagged cliffs and winding ridges seemed almost alive, a breathing relic of time that dwarfed our presence. We pitched our tent at one of the more remote sites, a spot Drew had picked for its supposed serenity. No crowds, he'd said, just us and nature. It was quiet, all right. Too quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. The air carried the faint scent of juniper and earth, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. Drew and I shared a few beers by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, until exhaustion claimed us. The second night was when things began to feel off. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was Drew playing a prank. We'd been sitting around the fire again, the flames casting long shadows that danced against the jagged rocks surrounding our site. I'd stepped away to grab something from the tent when I heard it faint and almost melodic, like a breeze weaving through the canyon. Caleb. The sound stopped me in my tracks. I spun around, half expecting Drew to be standing there with a smirk on his face. But he was still by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. "You say something?" I called out. Drew looked up, confused. "No." "Why?" I forced a laugh, brushing it off as my imagination. "Nothing. Thought I heard something, that's all." He shrugged and went back to tending the fire. But the unease in my chest lingered. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry soil just beyond the thin fabric barrier. My heart leapt into my throat. "Drew," I whispered. He groaned beside me, clearly still half asleep. "What? Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Before I could respond, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me like a weight. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks and scattered brush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I lingered there for a moment, scanning the shadows, before retreating back into the tent. Drew was already snoring again, oblivious. I told myself it was probably just an animal, and tried to go back to sleep. But every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I told Drew what had happened. "Probably a coyote or something," he said between bites of a granola bar. "They are all over the place out here." "Coyotes don't whisper," I muttered. He laughed, but it didn't feel genuine. I could tell he was trying to brush it off, just as I had the night before. We spent the day hiking along one of the less-traveled trails, hoping the exercise and sunlight would shake the unease. The views were stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch Drew glancing over his shoulder too, his face tight with unease. Neither of us said anything about it, but the tension between us grew heavier as the day wore on. That night, the whispers came back. They started just as we were settling into our sleeping bags, faint and indistinct at first, like the murmurs of a distant conversation carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked Drew. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the lantern. We sat in silence, straining to make out the words. The voices seemed to come from all around us, bouncing off the canyon walls in an eerie echo. Caleb. The sound of my name made my blood run cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Drew's eyes were wide with fear. It said my name too. We bolted out of the tent, flashlights in hand, and scanned the area. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak flickering light over the campsite. Beyond its glow, the darkness was impenetrable. "Who's out there?" Drew shouted, his voice cracking. No response. We stayed up the rest of the night, backs pressed against the rocks with our flashlights trained on the shadows. The whispers faded as the hours dragged on, but neither of us dared to close our eyes. By morning, we were both on edge. Drew suggested packing up and heading back to the main campground, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. Something about the whispers felt personal, like they were meant for us. I wanted answers, though I wasn't sure I would like what I found. We decided to stay one more night. The final night was worse than I could have imagined. The whispers started earlier this time, as we sat by the fire. They were louder now, clearer. "Leave." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Drew and I froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his face pale. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Scrambling to pack up our gear, we were both shaking with adrenaline. But the whispers didn't stop. "Caleb! Drew!" The voices were everywhere, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear. They grew louder and louder until it felt like they were screaming inside my head. "Go." The command was deafening. We grabbed what we could and ran, leaving the tent and most of our supplies behind. The trail back to the main campground felt endless, the darkness around us alive with movement and sound. I swear I could feel something following us. Its presence heavy and oppressive. Drew kept looking over his shoulder, his face a mask of terror. When we finally reached the safety of the main campground, the whispers stopped. We reported what had happened to a park ranger the next morning. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first to experience something like that," he said quietly. "The canyon has a way of playing tricks on people." I wanted to press him for more information, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever he knew, it wasn't something he was willing to share. I haven't been back to the Grand Canyon since that trip. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in our heads, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. The whispers were real. And they weren't just voices. They were something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't want us there. The memory of that night still grips me like a vice, its cold fingers curling around my throat whenever I try to push it away. It was March of 2021, a month I thought would be the beginning of something new, a break from the suffocating routine of pandemic isolation. Zion National Park seemed like the perfect escape. I had rented an RV for a week of solitude, a chance to breathe in the wilderness and lose myself in the grandeur of nature. But what I found was far from peace. I arrived in the late afternoon, the towering sandstone cliffs casting long shadows over the campground. It was early in the season, and the park was almost eerily quiet. Only a handful of other RVs dotted the designated lot, each spaced generously apart to preserve the illusion of isolation. By sunset, those few neighbors had packed up and left, leaving me completely alone. Or so I thought. The wind had started to pick up by the time I settled in for the night. My RV rocked gently, a comforting reminder of the stormy nights of my childhood when I would fall asleep to the sound of rain pelting the roof. I brewed a cup of tea, pulled out a novel I'd been meaning to finish, and let the world outside blur into the background. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed it, the faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds. But when I peered through the RV window, I saw a small, flickering light swaying in the darkness. A lantern. It hung suspended from what seemed to be an invisible hand, moving as though someone was carrying it, but I couldn't make out a figure. I told myself it was a trick of the light, perhaps another camper who'd arrived late and was setting up their site. Still, a knot of unease coiled in my stomach. The campground had been deserted when I arrived, and the ranger at the gate had mentioned that the area was mostly empty this time of year. I watched the lantern for a while, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The light bobbed and weaved as if it were being carried closer, but there was no sound, no crunch of footsteps on the gravel, no rustling of bushes. Just the wind, whistling low and mournful through the canyon. By the time the light reached the edge of my campsite, my curiosity had turned to dread. I told myself to stay put, to lock the RV door and wait for morning. But some irrational part of me, mixture of fear and fascination, compelled me to step outside. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and biting against my skin. I stood there, squinting into the dark, as the lantern came to a sudden stop about 20 feet away. It swayed gently, as though whoever or whatever held it was waiting for me to make the next move. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the vast emptiness around me. "Is someone there?" No answer. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on the gravel. The lantern didn't move. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I reached the edge of the light's glow. And that's when I saw it, an old, rusted lantern, hanging from a frayed piece of rope, tied to a skeletal tree branch. There was no one holding it. The flame inside flickered unnaturally, its light casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, an irrational urge to reach out and touch the glass. But as I raised my hand, the flame sputtered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The wind howled louder now, whipping through the trees like a chorus of wailing voices. I turned and ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call the ranger station, but there was no signal. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping, barely audible over the wind. It came from the side of the RV, a rhythmic, deliberate sound like fingers drumming on metal. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving along the length of the vehicle as though something, or someone, was circling it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. And then, slowly, the tapping started again, this time from the roof. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting to the small skylight above the kitchenette. Through the frosted glass, I could see a faint shadow moving, its shape indistinct, but undeniably human. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and crouched in the corner, my back against the cabinets. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before it finally disappeared. I stayed there all night, too afraid to move, my eyes fixed on the door. The wind eventually died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I drove straight out of Zion, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a diner and sat trembling over a cup of coffee, trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. Even now, 2 years later, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sometimes late at night, I will catch a glimpse of a flickering light out of the corner of my eye, and I'll hear that soft tapping in my dreams. And every time, I wake up with the same question echoing in my mind. Not yet, but when? It's strange how the most tranquil places can betray you. I'd always thought the desert, with its stillness and vastness, was a sanctuary. A place where you could breathe freely and let the world fade away. That was before Camp Verde. Before the night, everything I believed about solitude turned into something I could never explain, let alone forget. I parked my RV at a campsite tucked away from the main road. It wasn't an official site, just a quiet patch of earth by a creek that had long since dried up. The February air was cold and sharp, and the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky so clear it felt like you could fall into the stars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I spent the first few hours setting up. The silence out there wasn't just silence. It was oppressive. No distant hum of traffic, no rustling of leaves, no chirping crickets. Just the eerie, all-encompassing void of sound. It pressed down on me like an invisible weight. By the time I started a fire, the feeling had begun. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It's normal, I told myself, to feel a little on edge when you're miles away from anyone. But it wasn't just the usual unease that comes with isolation. This was sharper, deeper, a sensation that crawled under my skin and whispered that I wasn't alone. The first time I saw her, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, when something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my head, expecting to see a branch swaying, or maybe a shadow cast by the firelight. Instead, I saw her. An old woman standing just beyond the firelight's reach. She was still, impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Her face was pale, almost glowing, framed by thin, wispy hair that clung to her skull like cobwebs. She wore a long, dark dress that billowed slightly in the breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound steady. She didn't move. Didn't even flinch. I rose from my chair, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding deafening in the silence. "Mom, are you lost? Do you need help?" Her head tilted slightly, just enough to make the gesture unnatural. Her eyes dark and empty fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Then, as if someone had hit a switch, she was gone. Not gone as in she turned and walked away. Gone as in 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been. My mind raced with explanations, one of them satisfying. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow from the fire playing with my eyes. Or maybe I had nodded off for a second and dreamed her. But, deep down, I knew better. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. I doused the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the doors behind me. The inside felt small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in as I tried to convince myself I was safe. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose piece of metal, but it wasn't random enough for that. The taps came in 3 step, tap, tap, followed by a pause. Then again tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to hear. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, though I didn't really believe it. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the tapping, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. No one was there. But the ground was different. Earlier, it had been smooth, undisturbed dirt. Now, it was covered in footprints. Bare footprints. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I sat there, flashlight clutched in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for morning to come. But the night wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was at the windows too, soft, deliberate, coming from all sides of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know I couldn't escape. I crouched on the floor, trying to stay out of sight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. But it grew louder, clearer. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. The tone wasn't angry or pleading, it was cold, detached, like someone reciting a list of facts. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, It did. Silence. The kind of silence that's worse than noise because it feels like something is holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, curled up on the floor, too terrified to move. Eventually, the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, chasing away the darkness. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were everywhere, circling the RV in chaotic patterns. And on the window, scrawled in the condensation, was a single word. Mine. I didn't stay to pack. I didn't care about the campfire ring, the folding chair, or the food I'd left in the cooler. I got into the RV and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from Camp Verde. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a vivid nightmare. But every time I close my eyes, I see her, standing there in the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly be alone again. People often say I have nerves of steel, a seasoned traveler who thrives on solitude and adventure. That was true until Fort Wilderness. I will never forget the cold, biting air of that November night. It was unseasonably chilly for Florida, and the campground had an eerie stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I had parked my RV in a secluded spot, away from the families and cheerful campers. I wanted peace, a place to think and escape the chaos of daily life. By day, Fort Wilderness is a beautiful place, tall pines, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and wildlife quietly weaving through the brush. But as night falls, it transforms. Shadows stretch impossibly long, and the air grows heavy with something I can only describe as foreboding. It was my second night there when I first heard it. At exactly midnight, a sound cut through the stillness. Chime. It wasn't loud, but it was impossibly clear, ringing through the trees like a bell suspended in the air. My heart jumped in my chest as I instinctively glanced at the clock. 12 a.m. Sharp. I stood frozen in the dim glow of my RV's kitchen light, straining to listen for anything else. The chime came again. Chime. I opened the door to the crisp night air, my breath misting as I stepped outside. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the lingering echo of that bell. Probably some kids playing a prank, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to sleep. The next day, I explored the campground. Families wandered by, laughing and chatting, their kids running wild with carefree abandon. I envied their ease. I considered asking someone about the sound, but stopped myself. What would I say? Did you hear a phantom bell in the middle of the night? I would sound insane. That night, the chime returned, exactly at midnight. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Chime. Chime. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like it was calling me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The sound came again, closer now. Chime. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The air felt wrong, heavier, like the atmosphere had thickened. I could feel it pressing against my skin, making it hard to breathe. I followed the sound, drawn deeper into the woods, past the marked trails and into the heart of the wilderness. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, but the bell, it wouldn't let me go. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling stone pedestal, barely visible in the moonlight. It looked ancient, covered in moss and strange carvings that I couldn't understand. And there, hanging in the air above it, was the source of the sound. A bell. It wasn't attached to anything, just hovering there, faintly glowing as it swayed back and forth. Chime. Chime. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. Bells don't float in the air. Then, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and my flashlight beam landed on a figure. It was a woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by a veil. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, pointing at the bell. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, and then another. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her body didn't quite work the way it should. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the chime of the bell echoing behind me. Chime, chime, chime. It followed me all the way back to my RV. By the third night, I was ready to leave. I had packed up most of my things and planned to drive out first thing in the morning. But midnight came too soon. This time, the chime wasn't outside, it was inside. Chime. I froze, clutching the edge of the counter as the sound reverberated through the small space. My eyes darted to the clock, 12 a.m. My breath hitched as I realized the chime was coming from the bathroom. The door creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. The light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And then I saw her, the same veiled woman, standing in the doorway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. She stepped closer, and as she did, the chime grew louder, more frantic. My ears rang with the deafening sound. I don't remember much after that. Just a blinding light and the sensation of falling. When I woke up, it was morning. The RV door was wide open, and my belongings were scattered across the ground outside. I didn't waste any time. I threw everything into the vehicle and drove out of Fort Wilderness without looking back. It has been 2 years since that night, but I still hear the bell sometimes. Not every night, but often enough to remind me that whatever I encountered at Fort Wilderness hasn't let go. I have tried researching the area, looking for answers. Some say the campground was built on the site of an old settlement, one that was abandoned after a series of mysterious deaths. Others claim the bell is a warning, a way to keep people away from something darker hidden in those woods. All I know is that I will never go back. And if you ever find yourself at Fort Wilderness, listen closely. When the clock strikes midnight and you hear the chime, don't follow it. Whatever's calling you isn't something you want to meet. I hadn't planned to stop at Baker's Hole that evening. It was supposed to be just another long stretch of highway, a casual drive through Montana's sweeping landscapes. But the storm rolled in faster than I expected, and the thought of navigating those winding roads under torrential rain was exactly appealing. Baker's Hole was a name I'd heard before a quiet campground nestled along the Madison River. Seemed harmless enough, the campground was almost deserted, save for a few scattered RVs that looked like they hadn't moved in months. Mine was the only vehicle that arrived that night. I backed into a spot near the tree line, the dense pines swaying ominously in the wind. As I killed the engine, the world around me went silent. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence you might expect in a forest. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, the kind that feels wrong. Like the woods were holding their breath. I set up quickly, the rain already pelting the roof of the RV. Inside, it was cramped but cozy enough. The radio was still playing faintly from earlier soft static interrupted by bursts of some old country song. I turned the dial, searching for a station. But all I got was static. No music, no news. Nothing but that grating, whispering hiss. As I fiddled with the dial, something caught my ear. It wasn't the static. It was underneath it, faint, almost imperceptible. Voices. The accident the river took them. I froze, hand hovering over the dial. The words were distorted, crackling like they were fighting to break through the static. I leaned in, pressing my ear closer to the speaker. All of them gone. The voice wasn't clear, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned the dial again, hoping to catch a station, any station. But the voices persisted. their words fractured and disjointed. Don't, stay, it's not safe. My chest tightened. I told myself it was interference, maybe some weird trick of the storm. But deep down I knew better. Something about those voices felt off. I tried to shake it off, turning the radio off entirely. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I could still hear the faint hum of static, almost like it had seeped into the air around me. I busied myself with dinner, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps crunching through the wet gravel, a faint tap against the RV's window. I told myself it was the wind, but I avoided looking too closely. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. The rain had slowed, but the storm's presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. I climbed into the narrow bed at the back of the RV, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily. I woke to the sound of static. At first, I thought I'd left the radio on, but I hadn't. The static was coming from somewhere else, deeper, like it was resonating through the walls of the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. And then I heard it. He's awake. The voice was low and guttural, almost drowned out by the static. But I heard it, clear as day. Don't let him leave. I scrambled to my feet, flipping on every light in the RV. The static grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to fill the entire space. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The static stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. My ears rang with the absence of sound, my pulse thundering in my chest. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run. And then I heard the knock. It was faint, almost polite. A soft tap, tap, tap against the RV door. My breath hitched. No one should have been out there. The campground was empty. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached for the curtain covering the small window on the door. Slowly, I pulled it back. There was nothing there. The knock came again. But it wasn't from the door anymore. It was from the window beside me. I turned, the blood draining from my face. The window was fogged up, rainwater streaking down the glass. But there was something else, a handprint, smeared and wet, slowly sliding down the pane. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The lights in the RV flickered, and the static returned, louder than ever. "Leave now." The voice was right in my ear, as if someone were standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air was electric, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the driver's seat, not caring that I was still in my pajamas. The engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear, tires skidding on the wet gravel as I sped out of the campground. The static followed me. Even as I hit the highway, the faint hum of those voices lingered, weaving in and out of the crackling noise on the radio. I turned it off, but the static didn't stop. It was inside the RV now, inside me. You can't outrun it. The voice was faint, but it was there, just beneath the static. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun broke over the horizon. By the time I pulled into a gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, muttering something about looking like I had seen a ghost. I didn't correct him. To this day, I don't know what I experienced at Baker's Hole. I've tried to rationalize it, blame it on the storm, or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was there that night. Something that wasn't human. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the static hums through the air, I swear I can still hear those voices. He's listening. It was early April 2023 when I decided to take a trip to Ruby Valley Campground in Nevada. I had heard it was a quiet, scenic place, a stretch of raw, untamed beauty nestled between the Ruby Mountains and the Humboldt Range. What I didn't know What I couldn't have known was how deeply this trip would alter the very fabric of my understanding of reality. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon, the sun slipping lazily behind jagged peaks. Shadows stretched long and crooked across the dusty ground. The air had a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be there. The campground wasn't crowded, just a couple of RVs scattered here and there. I parked my car near a picnic table that stood under a massive juniper tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The table looked off. Its weathered surface was splintered and warped as if it had been sitting there for decades, enduring years of storms, sun, and snow. But it wasn't the age of the table that unsettled me. It was the way the shadows pooled around it, deeper and darker than they had any right to be. The dying sunlight touched everything else around me. Trees, rocks, even my car. But the table seemed untouched by it, as though it existed in a pocket of perpetual twilight. I brushed off the unease, convincing myself I was just tired from the drive. I set up my tent nearby and decided to eat dinner at the picnic table. As I sat there, the air grew colder, unnaturally so, and I noticed something strange. No birds chirped, no crickets sang. The silence pressed against me like a weight, filling my ears with the sound of my own breathing. Then, I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted into the growing darkness, I realized there was a figure sitting at the far end of the table. It was barely more than a shadow, an outline of something vaguely human. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a cautious step toward it. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Its edges were blurry, indistinct, as though it wasn't fully there. And yet, I could feel its presence, an oppressive, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Are you okay?" I tried again. No response. I took another step closer, and that's when it moved. Not in the way a person shifts or turns, but in a way that defied explanation. One moment it was sitting at the table. The next, it was standing beside me. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting with fear. The figure had no face, no features. Just an empty void where a face should be. It radiated a cold so intense it burned, like standing in the heart of a glacier. I don't remember running to my car, but the next thing I knew, I was inside with the doors locked, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure was gone, or so I thought. When I glanced at the picnic table, it was there again, sitting as still as a statue. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in my car, watching the shadow figure, my mind racing with every possible explanation. A hallucination? A prank? Some twisted product of my overactive imagination? But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I dared to step out of the car. The shadow figure was gone, leaving the picnic table looking ordinary again. But the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, desperate to leave. As I folded my tent, I noticed something etched into the wood of the picnic table. At first, it looked like random scratches, but as I stared at it, the marks formed words. "It sees you." My blood turned to ice. I drove away from Ruby Valley Campground that morning, swearing never to return. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. At night, in the quiet of my apartment, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye. When I turn to look, there's nothing there. But I know better now. It's still with me.